Thank you for joining us today for this live streamed news conference we're doing for an update on the officer-involved shooting that took place on December 3rd of 2016. A couple of ground rules before we get started. We do have some press packets that Lieutenant Sell will be able to hand out to any of our media folks in the room. And what you're going to find in the press packets are two documents. The first document is going to be an updated press release, and the second document, excuse me, is a 9-page letter that we received yesterday from the Office of Special Prosecutions in Anchorage with their determination recommendation on whether the shoot was justifiable or not. Both the press release and the letter from the Special Prosecutor's Office are going to be available on our website after the news conference. Once we're done, I'll make sure it gets posted up there. So if you want to read the letter for yourself and come to your own determination, you're welcome to do that. What we're going to do today is we're going to have a couple of speakers. The mayor of the City and Borough of Juneau, Ken Kelch, is going to say a few words, followed by the chief of police, Bryce Johnson. Chief Johnson is going to make a few statements. He's going to go over some of the items from the officer-involved shooting. We have some audio recordings, some photographs, and some videotapes. Following his presentation, he will be able to accept questions from the audience. If you're here and you have a question, please raise your hand so the chief can call on you. And when you are called on, please give your name and your affiliation so we know who's asking the questions, because this is being live streamed to the world. And also, please follow us on Facebook and on Twitter. Everything that we are releasing here, we are going to be able to put on those formats as well. So with that, I'd like to introduce Mayor Ken Kelch to say a few words.
I'm Ken Kelch. I am the mayor of the city and borough of Juneau. As mayor, I want to commend the Juneau Police Department for entering into a full and transparent investigation of a recent officer-involved shooting. We are fortunate to live in a community where such occurrences are few and far between. I have complete confidence in the professionalism of our officers and the Juneau Police Department in total. Finally, I want to thank the state of Alaska for conducting a prompt, thorough, and impartial investigation into this matter. And with that, I will turn it over to Chief Johnson. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I know that means a lot to my officers. I appreciate the support we get from the community. And I really want to thank the community for giving us time to investigate what happened. We want to be very transparent and give you as much information as quick as we can. I'd like to thank you for having not speculated on what may have occurred, and that gave us the time and space to complete the investigation. I've been reminded of why I really love to live and to work here in Juneau, as the community's really come together and waited for the answers that I intend to provide today. The Alaska State Special Prosecutor's Office has cleared Sergeant Gifford and found that his actions complied with state law. Mr. Tinney pointed what looked like a rifle at paramedics, officers, and Sergeant Gifford fired one round with his department-issued AR-15 as he feared for his life and the lives of others. I'm going to talk today about the investigation of the officer-involved shooting. There's also an investigation of possible charges against Mr. Tinney, which is an ongoing investigation. Those potential charges will be forwarded to our local district attorney's office for their consideration. I just want to talk a minute about the process for the investigation of the officer-involved shooting. This was a joint investigation between the Juneau Police Department and the Alaska Bureau of Investigation, ABI. ABI sent 2 detectives to Juneau, and they had complete and full access to the scene. In fact, we turned command of the scene over to them. They dictated when evidence was collected, how it was collected, who had access. It was a joint investigation, but we turned operational command of it over to them for a period of time. So they had full and complete access to the scene, all of the evidence, the witnesses. ABI detectives completed the interviews of the officers involved, Sergeant Gifford and Officer Schultz. ABI did those interviews along with the interviews of several of our witnesses. The State Special Prosecutor's Office had full access to all JPD reports, video, audio, interviews, and evidence, as well as all those completed by ABI. It was a very open, thorough, and transparent investigation. In addition to the witness accounts, we have audio of the event from Officer Schultz's digital recorder. This audio captures both Officer Schultz and much of what could be heard from Sergeant Gifford. The digital recorder which Sergeant Gifford was wearing malfunctioned shortly into the incident, and all that can be heard on his digital recorder is static. There are recorded 911 calls and recordings of the radio transmissions that occurred during the incident. There's in-car camera video from Sergeant Gifford's vehicle that captures the initial contact and the interaction between Sergeant Gifford and Mr. Tinney at the front seat. You can hear the shot being fired on this video, but as I'll explain in detail later, you cannot see the officers nor Mr. Tinney on the video. It captures what occurs before, and you can hear the shot being fired. There's in-car camera video from Officer Schultz's car, which does not capture the incident of what occurred. There's a cell phone video, which was recorded by the neighbor. That neighbor started that cell phone video immediately after the shot was fired, and he recorded from that point until Mr. Tinney was arrested and a little bit after that. On that cell phone video, the neighbor narrates, when he first starts recording, he narrates what occurred prior to the shooting, and you have his narration of what occurred. I'd like to now read from a letter dated January 5th from the State of Alaska Attorney General's Office of Special Prosecution. It says, "Dear Chief Johnson, this letter summarizes my review of the use of deadly force by Juneau Police Sergeant Christopher Gifford against Jeremy Sean Tinney on December 3rd, 2016. The investigation revealed that Sergeant Gifford fired one bullet after being threatened with what he believed to be a firearm. Tinney was treated for non-life-threatening injuries and was released from the hospital. For the reasons explained below, I have concluded that Sergeant Gifford was legally justified in using deadly force. It is clear from the investigation that Tinney threatened the sergeant and others at the scene, and Sergeant Gifford fired his weapon, reasonably believing that he was acting in self-defense and defense of others. Criminal charges are inappropriate for Sergeant Gifford." And the conclusion says, "I will not institute criminal charges against Sergeant Gifford in regard to the wounding of Jeremy Sean Tinney on December 3rd, 2016. Under the circumstances in this case, Sergeant Gifford was entitled to use deadly force to protect himself, his fellow officers, firefighters, and civilians at the scene. The sergeant acted within the law when he shot at Tinney." And again, you have that full letter, which you have in your press packet. I'm now going to go through a rather detailed summary of what occurred leading up to the shooting. It was in the early morning of Saturday, December 3rd. Mr. Tinney and another passenger were involved in a single vehicle accident where the car went off the side of the road and into a ditch. The passenger got out of the car and he made a phone call to his wife and told his wife about the accident. The wife called JPD to report what had occurred, but the passenger did not want to call the police himself, and we were unsure about what the location was at that time because they didn't know where they were at. That passenger later was able to make contact with a neighbor that was in the area, and that neighbor called JPD at 3:55. It was 3:55 when the passenger's wife called JPD, and it was 4:05 in the morning when the neighbor called JPD and reported that the incident was occurring on Ocean View Drive. At 4:05, JPD Sergeant Gifford and Officer Schultz were dispatched to Ocean View Drive along with Capital City Fire and Rescue. Sergeant Gifford called in the area first at 4:12 in the morning. Sergeant Gifford met with the neighbor who had called 911. The neighbor, who was at this point out on the road, can we pull up that first picture, please? So this was the car in the ditch. I'm going to pull these lights down just a little bit. This is the car in the ditch. This is actually a pretty steep angle. It's about 45 degrees, and this was a rainy, wet, sloppy evening. It was really slick. And so the passenger had gone down into the ditch and was down at the ditch by the car when Sergeant Gifford arrived. Can we go to that next picture, please? And so this is a view back a little bit. This is the car still in the ditch. This is the front of the car. This is the rear of the car. It's an SUV, a Jeep, so it's got the front seats, the middle row of seats, and the back cargo area. This is Officer Schultz's car, and this is Sergeant Gifford's car, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So when Sergeant Gifford gets there, the other occupant that was in the car was down in that ditch area. when Sergeant Gifford contacted the neighbor who was right here up here on the street, that neighbor had a gun, which he had in his the pocket of his hoodie. Sergeant Gifford got a quick description of what was occurring, identified that there was a firearm with this person, and asked him to secure the weapon, which he did without any incident. At about 4:14 in the morning, Officer Schultz also arrived in the area. As you can see, the vehicle was off the side of the road in a ditch. The passenger again had returned to the vehicle prior to Sergeant Gifford arriving. Sergeant Gifford went down the side of the road to help the passenger and the occupant that was still in the car. As Sergeant Gifford was working his way down the side into the ditch, that passenger crawled back up out of the ditch to the side of the road. Officer Schultz remained on the road with the passenger. Sergeant Gifford was still in the ditch with the vehicle, trying to help the person who was still in the driver's seat of the car, and that person was not responding to Sergeant Gifford. At 4:18 in the morning, Sergeant Gifford called for an ambulance as he was trying to get medical aid to help that person that was in the car. As Sergeant Gifford was down at the car and Officer Schultz was still up on the side of the road, they had a conversation that the vehicle that was down in the ditch was the same vehicle that had been involved in a police pursuit earlier in the night, and that the person in the car was possibly Jeremy Tinney. At 4:19, Sergeant Gifford moved from the driver door to the rear of the vehicle. So he had been at the driver door trying to help Mr. Tinney. He moved back to the rear of the vehicle so he could run the license plate of the vehicle. When he ran the license plate of the vehicle, it was verified that that car was in fact the same car that had fled from officers earlier in the night in a short vehicle pursuit, and that the occupant of the car was Mr. Tinney. Sergeant Gifford was also notified by dispatch that Mr. Tinney had a served protective order. At 4:24, Sergeant Gifford returned to the driver door to again try to help Mr. Tinney. Sergeant Gifford touched Mr. Tinney's elbow and tried to communicate with Mr. Tinney. At this time, Mr. Tinney had both arms to the passenger side. So you can see this car is at a 45-degree angle. So as Mr. Tinney's sitting in the car, he's leaning downhill. His hands are off to the side into where the passenger, the center console would be. When Sergeant Gifford touched his elbow, Mr. Tinney immediately started to move. Sergeant Gifford said that he moved quickly and deliberately and reached into that center console in a manner that he thought the only thing he could be reaching for was a weapon. And Sergeant Gifford thought that Mr. Tinney at that point was reaching for a weapon. Sergeant Gifford immediately tried to de-escalate the situation by backing off and moving back up the side of the road. As Sergeant Gifford was trying to de-escalate and to retreat, Mr. Tinney on at least 2 occasions made a finger gun, pointed it in the direction of Sergeant Gifford, and implied that he was shooting Sergeant Gifford. Sergeant Gifford drew his service pistol as he tried to retreat up the side of that ditch. Due to the steep grade, and it was raining, and it was slippery, and it was really poor footing, Sergeant Gifford had to turn his back to Mr. Tinney as he moved back up the side of the road. At that time, Sergeant Gifford was fearful that Mr. Tinney would shoot him in the back as he retreated. Once back to the top of the road, Sergeant Gifford and Officer Schultz talked together to come up with a plan. Sergeant Gifford reholsters his pistol, and the two of them talked to decide how they want to try to deal with this situation. Their plan was to again try to de-escalate the situation by bringing up a Capital City Fire and Rescue vehicle, which had large lights on top of it to illuminate the entire area. At 4:27, they called on the radio for a large fire truck which had those floodlights. At 4:34 in the morning, JPD dispatch advised Sergeant Gifford and Officer Schultz of a 2012 threat made by Mr. Tinney to shoot police officers and that he had body armor. Both Sergeant Gifford and Officer Schultz were already aware of past interactions with Mr. Tinney. Mr. Tinney left the driver area of the vehicle. So he had been up in this driver area. He left that driver area, crawled over the seat into the middle compartment, and then crawled over that seat again into the very back cargo compartment of the vehicle. The officers at that point radioed that Mr. Tinney was barricading himself in the vehicle. What barricading means is he was creating a stronghold position for himself that is defensible. This greatly increases the risk to the officers and is an escalating behavior of a suspect. With the floodlights from the fire truck, the officers could see that Mr. Tinney was retrieving what looked like a long object from the back of the vehicle. Both Sergeant Gifford and Officer Schultz deployed their department-issued AR-15 rifles from their police vehicles. They then returned to the patrol vehicle with Sergeant Gifford at the front of the vehicle and Officer Schultz to the rear. So they retrieved their rifles and they took positions at this car right here. The fire truck was lighting up this car. The rear windows of the SUV were tinted, but through the front window and the front passenger windows, you could see through it. So Sergeant Gifford took a position right here where he was trying to utilize cover, and he could see down in, and Officer Schultz was at the back of the vehicle, again, trying to utilize cover in a position where he could see what was going on in the car. Sergeant Gifford and Officer Schultz then saw Mr. Tinney with an object in his hands. The officers communicated with each other to try to identify what the object was. Mr. Tinney first picked up what the officers thought was a piece of wood, which turned out to be a vacuum handle. Mr. Tinney then put that down and picked up another object. The object was then identified by both Sergeant Gifford and Officer Schultz as the barrel of a rifle. Officer Schultz told Sergeant Gifford that the object was a barrel. You can hear on the audio that we're going to listen to in a minute, he identifies that's a barrel, and they thought they were looking at a rifle. Mr. Tinney was holding what looked like the barrel of a rifle, consistent with the manner that both Sergeant Gifford and Officer Tinney know to be how someone would hold a rifle. Mr. Tinney was holding what looked like a rifle and pointing it at Officer Schultz initially and then sweeping it back and forth. So he had this object in his hands, holding it like a rifle. He would point it at Officer Schultz, and there was a paramedic right there as well. He swung it back over and pointed it at Sergeant Gifford, and he was moving the rifle around, pointing it at officers, the sergeant, the firefighters, the paramedics, and there were other citizens that were out there as well. Officers gave at least 2 verbal commands to Mr. Tinney to put it down. Officer Schultz believed a rifle was being pointed at him and that he was about to be shot. A CCFR paramedic had previously moved up behind Officer Schultz in further attempts to help Mr. Tinney. Officer Schultz believed that he and/or the paramedic would be shot. Officer Schultz felt responsible for the safety of the paramedic. Officer Schultz told the paramedic to get back and physically pushed him back to get him out of the line of fire to safety. Officer Schultz fully believed that a rifle was being pointed at him and thought that his life and the paramedic's life were in danger. Officer Schultz stated that if the paramedic had not been there and had he not felt responsible to move him out of the way, he would have fired his weapon in defense of his own life. Sergeant Gifford saw Mr. Tinney pointing what he believed to be a rifle at Officer Schultz and the paramedic. Sergeant Gifford believed Officer Schultz and the paramedic's lives were in imminent danger. Sergeant Gifford then saw Mr. Tinney swing the barrel towards him. Sergeant Gifford could see the tip of the barrel and the rifle bore, and he believed he was looking down the barrel of a rifle. The rifle was being pointed at other people and at Sergeant Gifford. Sergeant Gifford believed that he was going to be shot. Sergeant Gifford gave a verbal command, put it down, which was not complied with. At 4:35 in the morning, approximately 21 minutes after arriving on the scene, Sergeant Gifford fired 1 round from his department-issued AR-15 in defense of his own life and in defense of the lives of the other officer and paramedics present. The 1 shot fired went through the rear driver window and the rear headrest and did not penetrate Mr. Tinney. Mr. Tinney had wounds from glass and other shrapnel, which struck him in the neck and torso. The actual slug from the round being fired was found in Mr. Tinney's clothing and was recovered from his clothing. Mr. Tinney then began making loud banging noises. We think he was trying to break out the back window of the vehicle in an attempt to escape. Unable to do that, Mr. Tinney exited the vehicle out the rear passenger door. Both Sergeant Gifford and Officer Schultz continued to give Mr. Tinney verbal commands, which now Mr. Tinney did comply with. The officers, with the assistance of the Capital City Fire and Rescue paramedic, were able to secure Mr. Tinney, and Mr. Tinney was immediately rendered medical attention. The item recovered in the back of the vehicle, which Mr. Tinney was holding and using as a rifle, was a 3 1/2 foot rifle bored axle shaft assembly. If we could forward to that next picture. So this is the tip of that axle shaft assembly, which both Officer Schultz and Sergeant Gifford saw, and they saw it being pointed at them, being swung around. You can see it looked much like the barrel of a rifle. If we can go to the next one. And to the next one, please. You can see the tip of that. Officer Schultz very clearly describes a barrel with the barrel bored out in the middle of it. He thought a rifle was being pointed at him. Sergeant Gifford also very much believed that was a rifle with the rifle bore pulled out. They both identified exactly what kind of rifles they thought it was. They fully believed that a rifle was being pointed at them and that they were about to be shot. I would point out also both officers were wearing their body armor, but unfortunately the body armor doesn't usually stop rifle rounds, so this was very much a threat to their life, and they were very likely to be killed with a rifle shot of that type. Next one, please. This is the full object. So the way he was holding that, he had the bigger part that is, you can see in the back there, he had that tucked up on his arm, as you could imagine a rifle with the stock coming up in your arm, with the long barrel pointing out, with the rifle shaft in front. He was pointing that at Officer Schultz, at the paramedics, swinging it back to point it at Sergeant Gifford as well, and pointing it at the people that were there. We're now going to play for you some of the video from Sergeant Gifford's in-car camera, which captures the initial contact between Sergeant Gifford and the complainant, and then the initial contact at the scene. We're then going to watch video of the interaction between Sergeant Gifford and Mr. Tinney at the door, and then we'll watch a short video that captures the shot being fired. Again, you cannot see what's occurring in that particular video, so we'll play those 3 videos. I'm going to turn these lights down to help people see a little bit. So this is Sergeant Gifford as he's arriving on scene. That's the neighbor witness. This is going to be the witness that ends up taking the cell phone video.
Passenger in the ditch, right, Chief?
Yes, the passenger this time is down in the ditch there. You can see him moving down in there. Mr. Tinney is in the car. So Sergeant Gifford is going to contact our complainant and get some information from him. So you can see there's a bulge right here sticking out that hoodie. He had a handgun in his hoodie. He felt he needed that. Something was happening at 4 o'clock in the morning on his street. Sergeant Gifford very calmly and professionally asked him to go and secure that weapon, which he immediately complies with. And there's really no incident there. He's a very good witness. There is an audio on the in-car camera video portions. The audio picks up some sound, but you can't hear what people are saying. We'll have to listen to another medium in a minute to hear what's going on. So you can see Officer Schultz arrives with his vehicle. Sergeant Gifford's trying to see what's going on, figure out what he has. He decides to crawl down that steep embankment to go down and try to help the people down there. See, it's wet, it's very messy, difficult footing. That's the passenger coming up out of the ditch. He's able to crawl up out of the ditch, and Officer Schultz tries to help him there. At this point, Sergeant Gifford, he's still trying to communicate with Mr. Tinney. He's trying to get him some help. That's when they have the conversation that perhaps the vehicle that they're looking at was the vehicle that was involved in the pursuit. Sergeant Gifford walks to the back of the car, runs the license plate. It's verified that it was the vehicle involved in the pursuit. He gets notified of a protective order. He realizes it really is Mr. Tinney in the front seat. He walks back up, and we're going to watch the video of now the interaction between Sergeant Gifford and Mr. Tinney in the front seat. So Sergeant Gifford's down in the ditch at the door there here in a second. Sergeant Gifford opens the door. He's going to touch Mr. Tinney's elbow to try to communicate with him. Then you'll see here something changes. Sergeant Gifford's trying to look and see what he's reaching for. He believes he's reaching for a weapon. He retreats. He draws his own weapon. He turns to check what's going on as he's trying to get back up, and he's having to turn his back. He frees right there. You can see this is where Mr. Tinney, one of the times in which he took his hand, pointed at what looks to us to be like a finger gun, and implies that he's going to shoot Sergeant Gifford or perhaps the other people up there. Sergeant Gifford continues to retreat back up to the road, holsters his sidearm, and this is where the sergeant and the officer stop and talk for a minute to try to come up with a plan to determine how they're gonna act next. The next video we're going to show, this is going to have the audio of the shot being fired. Can you pause this for a second, sir? So Sergeant Gifford is right here. You can't see him because he's off the frame of the camera. Officer Schultz is back here because of the light that's shining. There's no video of that. By this time, Mr. Tinney is in the back part of the vehicle, so you can't see from this angle because this is where the tinted windows are and there's not light there. The light's coming off the fire truck through the front windshield and some off this front area of the car. So from their vantage point, they can see into the car. They can see that barrel of the rifle being pointed at them. Go ahead. We're now going to play the digital audio recorded by Officer Schultz, which captures what the officers were talking about, what they identified. It also captures that same shot being fired.
What? I don't know. Put it down. What the hell does he have? Put it down. It looks like a barrel.
As the shot was fired.
Dispatch, no, the meeting's running call. City 114. My bad, I got it. City 114, we need medical, and one shot fired by us.
So as you can hear, first they identify they think it's a piece of wood. Again, he picked up that first object, which ended up being the vacuum handle. He then picks up what looks for all purposes as a rifle. They identify that rifle as being pointed at them. Officer Schultz is trying to get the paramedic to safety. He comes back. Sergeant Gifford fires the round. Officer Schultz is unsure as to who fired that round. He thinks he's being shot at by Mr. Tinney. That's why they communicate, did you fire, did we fire? And Sergeant Gifford lets him know that he fired that round. Okay. We're now going to play the cell phone video that was captured by the witness in the area. The cell phone video is going to start immediately after the shot is fired, but he's going to go back and narrate what happened beforehand. Some of this footage, hold on just a second. Some of the footage is just a little bit rough. There is a bit of cursing in it, and I apologize for that, but we thought we'd get you what they were actually seeing at the time.
Holy shit, they just shot. Okay, John. They yelled, put it down, and then one police guy fired one shot with the AR, it sounded like, into the vehicle. And then I grabbed my camera.
It's Mr. Tinney walking up out of the ditch now, complying with the officer's commands. You can see that's the paramedic that was up there who assists the officers, immediately renders medical attention. So you can see in that after, once Mr. Tinney complied with what the officers asked him to do, they call him up out of the ditch, and they're able to secure him without any further incident. We're going to watch one more short video. This one's a digital recreation of the scene, which might help you visualize a little better of what was there. So this is ocean view. This video the recreation was done a couple days after, but it recreates the scene for us. We can see where the car was, kind of where Sergeant Gifford's position is, and how the shot was fired. The shot went through this middle window here on the driver's side. Then you'll see it goes through a headrest. Into the rear passenger area where Mr. Tinney was. Again, that round did not penetrate Mr. Tinney. The injuries he had was from shrapnel from the round going through the window, and as things fragmented as it went through, the round itself was recovered in his clothing. That's good, Dave. So both Sergeant Gifford and Officer Schultz tried and intended to render aid to Mr. Tinney. Both Sergeant Gifford and Officer Schultz acted heroically to defend the life of others when Mr. Tinney did not accept that aid and escalated the encounter. Sergeant Gifford did what he was trained to do and what I expect him to do. Any reasonable police officer in a similar situation would make the same difficult decision. Sergeant Gifford acted with respect, integrity, and courage, and he is an outstanding police sergeant. And again, to summarize, I'd like to review the Special Prosecutor's Office has cleared Sergeant Gifford and found that his actions complied with state law. Mr. Tinney pointed what looked like a rifle at paramedics, officers, and Sergeant Gifford. Sergeant Gifford fired one round with his department-issued AR-15 as he feared for his life and the lives of others. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have.
Matt Miller from KTOO. If Mr. Tinney was not hit by the round, if it impacted in the side of the vehicle, then how was the round evidently recovered from his clothing?
It was in his clothing, so it did not penetrate Mr. Tinney. So the round was recovered in his clothing. The round had lost velocity when it went through the window and went through the headrest. That by the time it got to him, it had lost velocity and did not have enough velocity to penetrate the clothing or him.
Okay.
So the injuries which he had was from the shrapnel that was created when the round went through the window and went through the headrest, and perhaps some from metal shavings from the round itself coming out through that.
So maybe I misunderstood here, but maybe you can clarify. If the round went through the headrest, I thought I heard you also say that it impacted on the side of the vehicle at the rear.
Put that one back up, please. So it impacts through this window. This is the middle window. Goes through this window. Through Mr. Tinney's in this back passenger compartment. So it goes through the window, through the headrest. It had lost velocity at that point, and so it doesn't have enough velocity to at that point impact Mr. Tinney. But the round itself was recovered in his clothing.
I'm just searching for a better explanation here. So are you saying that the round went through the headrest, impacted with the metal inside the headrest, broke apart, parts of it were in the back of the vehicle, parts of it were in his clothing after it?
I can't tell you where those particular fragments that hit Mr. Tinney came from. It could have been glass from when the round went through the glass. It could have been tiny metal pieces as that round went through it. Could have been part of that headrest. What hit Mr. Tinney were small pieces of shrapnel. They were superficial wounds. You can see clearly he's able to stand up and walk back out of where he's at. The bullet itself did not penetrate him. It did not impact him. What he was hit with was shrapnel from the bullet going through that car.
And so when you say superficial wounds, you mean he was scratched or he had some sort of...
If you read the report that was generated there, they're very clearly described as superficial wounds, and that he's released very quickly from the hospital. They were very much non-life-threatening injuries and superficial wounds.
Another question, what can you explain a little bit about the training that Juneau police officers go through? When they respond to a situation like this, is just the appearance of a weapon, is that enough of a threat to possibly use lethal force themselves, or do they have to wait till they're being fired upon? What's the normal routine?
You don't have to wait until you're being fired on. If you wait until you're being fired on, it's too late and you will be dead, and that is a bad outcome. And so in order to use deadly force, you have to reasonably believe that your life is in imminent danger, or the life of someone else is in imminent danger or threat of death. So what you have in this case is you have a previous threat from the person that he is going to shoot police officers. And if you tell us you are going to shoot us, we're going to believe you. We'll take you at your word. So you had a threat that he was going to shoot us. You had a threat at the scene, was how they interpreted it, as he made the finger gun, intimating that he was shooting the officers. The officers believed that he was trying to get a weapon. He retrieved an object out of the back of the car that looked exactly like a rifle. He held it like a rifle. He pointed it at paramedics, officers, other people there, as if it were a rifle. So the officers were in fear that they were about to get shot, and they were justified in using deadly force to defend themselves and the other people at that scene.
Was there any other substances in Mr. Tinney's blood besides alcohol?
I do not have that information. He did have alcohol, I know that, but I don't know what else was in there. Anyone else?
Would the use of body cameras, would this help the investigation at all?
That's speculative. The body camera, in theory, would capture the perspective of the officer, so it would let you see what they were seeing into that car. But that would just be a guess. I look forward to having body cameras. I don't know if it would have captured something more helpful in this case or not. In this case, we do have a lot and very compelling evidence of what occurred. We do have video, we've got the audio, we've got the witness statements from the people at the scene. So I'm quite comfortable that we have a really good picture of what occurred. And I look forward to having that body camera when we get it.
When are they going to be implemented, or when are they going to be started being used on a regular basis?
We should have the first ones here in 3 or 4 months. We'll have the first couple out.
And I may have missed this real briefly when I was taking notes here, but or going through the background here, but what's any sort of implications for Sergeant Gifford as far as his service here, his employment? Is he being returned to active duty? Can you explain a little bit more about that? And also the other officer involved.
So Officer Schultz returned to full duty shortly after the incident occurred, and he's doing very well. Sergeant Gifford returned to work several weeks ago. We had him on a desk assignment from that time till now. Now that he's been cleared and he's been found justified in what he did, and I have found him to have acted in the manner in which I would expect him to act and how he was trained, he will be returned to full duty, and he will do that at his next day that he's scheduled to work. So in the next few days, he will be back out and working and back at full duty. And he has my complete faith and complete support. He again did exactly what he was trained to do. He did what any reasonable police officer would do, make a really hard decision in a difficult set of circumstances that he was put in. So he will be back to full duty.
If the other officer did not pull the trigger, why was he placed on administrative duty? Maybe you can explain that.
So initially, when we first had the scene, when Mr. Tinney first went to the hospital, it was described that he had multiple entry wounds. So when that bolt went through and it fragmented, he had multiple entries on his neck and torso. So we were unsure at that point of how many rounds were fired. And it took us a little time to investigate to find out what happened. So because we were unsure initially right after and we wanted to do an investigation, I took that action of having both officers be placed on leave for a brief period of time. It became very apparent very shortly into the investigation that Officer Schultz didn't fire his weapon and there was only one round fired. And so as soon as I was very sure of that, that's when Officer Schultz went back to full duty.
And just to be clear, that round that was fired, that was from
Sergeant Gifford.
Rifle, right?
That was from Sergeant Gifford, yes.
And that was the rifle?
Correct, yes.
Oh. What's the current status of Mr. Tinney?
Mr. Tinney, I believe, is still in the Seattle area. I understand he has some legal trouble in Washington, which he has to take care of before he can leave there. So last I heard, he was still down in the Seattle area.
Is the Juneau DA, the Juneau Police Department contemplating any potential charges against him?
So like I said, today I'm talking about the officer-involved shooting. There is an open investigation on criminal charges, and those will be referred to our local district attorney's office, yes.
Can you talk a little bit more about what those charges may be?
No, I can't talk about what those charges are. As soon as I can, I would love to do that, but that's not something I can talk about right now.
Is this something that would require perhaps extradition to Alaska?
It's far too early to say. We're under.
Mr. Scott, do you want to come up here?
I'm sorry.
No, you're fine. Please come up.
It's far too early to say. That part of this situation is governed by legal and ethical rules that explicitly prohibit us from talking in a forum like this about what might happen in a pending criminal investigation. And I joined the chief. As soon as I can talk about that, I look forward to doing so, but today's not the time or the place to do that.
Any other questions?
Sorry, I have a quick question. He already asked a question about charges. You referred to the item that he was, that was believed to be a rifle as a rifle board axle. Can you be a little more specific about that? I didn't really understand what that meant.
It's an axle rod. It's 3.5 feet long. Can you go back to that picture of that? Let's go back to that one. So you can see the tip of this is bored out in the middle, like a rifle would be bored out. So it looks very much like a rifle when it's being pointed right at you. It looks like a rifle. I'm looking at that. I think I got a barrel of a rifle being pointed at me. Go ahead.
I just want to interject. I think that the term rifled bored axle isn't something we just created.
Right.
That is what it's actually called in like the automotive industry. So
I appreciate that.
we didn't pick that out ourselves. It's called a rifled bored axle.
And then if you go to back to this next picture, please. Forward two. So this is what it looks like entirely. So it goes. I'm not a mechanic. It hooks your car tire to the rest of the car. That's the axle. The long shaft looking like a rifle barrel is bored out in the middle. That extended part in the back is what he had tucked into his arm. It looked like the stock of a rifle when they were out there. He was holding it like a rifle, pointing it at Officer Schultz, pointing it at the paramedic, pointing it at Sergeant Gifford. They thought that was a rifle being pointed at them. They fully expected to be shot at any time.
Is that an axle to a full-size vehicle or an ATV? Any idea?
I believe it was an axle to an SUV. All right, if there aren't any other questions, I'd like to thank you for coming. I would like to just say again how much I appreciate the community having given us time to complete the investigation, for not having speculated on what occurred. I think that allowed us to do a very thorough and complete investigation, and it really does remind us all of why we love to live and work here because of the great community we have. And with that, I'll say good night. Thank you.